Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third Read for Pixels panel in a series of live stream panel sessions with authors and editors, held as part of the launch of our first ever charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due. This panel is also part of the Pixel Project's program for Domestic Violence Awareness Month 2021, which just kicked off in the 1st of October. My name is Anisha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this panel session. This anthology is part of the Read for Pixels program, through which we work with award-winning and best-selling authors to raise awareness for our work to end violence against women and girls. Today's YouTube session is also the 13th Read for Pixels live stream author panel. The Pixel Project created this multi-author panel sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. So what better topic for an anthology panel session series than The Devil at Home, writing about domestic violence in science fiction and fantasy. So as you can see, we have an excellent panel with us today. Here to take part in the discussion are two award-winning and best-selling speculative fiction authors who have all contributed wonderfully spine-chilling, thought-provoking stories to our anthology. We have Angela Yuriko Smith, who is down there at the bottom. She's an American poet, Stoker-nominated author, and co-publisher of Space and Time magazine, a publication that has been printing speculative fiction, art, and poetry since 1966. And we have Jason Sanford. He's a two-time finalist for the Nebula Award, who has published dozens of stories in Asimov's science fiction, Interzone, Apex Magazine, among numerous others. And his first novel, Plague Birds, was just recently published. You have it there, Jason? Yeah, there it is. It's a great cover. So Jason was born and raised in the American South, and his previous experience includes work as an archaeologist and as a Peace Corps volunteer. And we have with us also our editor of Giving the Devil His Due, Rebecca Brewer. Hi, Rebecca. So Rebecca is a freelance editor specializing in science fiction, fantasy, horror, and LGBTQ+ fiction at Brewer Editorial Services. Previously, she was an editor at Ace Rock under Penguin Random House. Rebecca was introduced to the Pixel Project by the one and only Guy Gavriel Kay and has worked with us for 2 years and counting to bring the anthology into the world. We're so glad to have all of you here today. So before we get into the actual discussion, I just want to say to the audience, all of you can participate. You may ask the panel questions. You just have to make sure you're logged on to your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box. And Regina, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to us, and I'll read them out loud for the panel to answer. Oh, and for those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of Giving the Devil His Due, you can order it from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon. There it is. Angela's holding it up. It's on Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. All net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. All right, so let's get to the discussion. I'm going to give everybody an introduction, and then we'll get to the first question. So we're talking about domestic violence. For a long time in fiction, violence against women has been used as an easy metaphor for the evil in the world and as a catalyst for the male hero's actions. While femicide, rape, sex trafficking, and slavery of women and fridging are VAW tropes that have been extensively deployed and critiqued in speculative fiction, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror, domestic violence, including dating violence, marital rape, and coercive control, is less frequently used in speculative fiction and more commonly seen in mystery and crime and romance genres, for example. So domestic violence tends to appear in speculative fiction where genres overlap. For example, paranormal romance, YA fantasy, or when horror or urban fantasy intersects with mystery and crime. Paranormal fantasy and YA fantasy in particular can sometimes lean very heavily on toxic tropes and stereotypes that portray domineering alpha male characters, coercive control, and stalking as sexy without showing the real and horrific costs and consequences of domestic violence appropriately. In fact, it is only relatively recently that fantasy series such as the Courtyard of the Other series by Anne Bishop and Soulwood by Faith Hunter have emerged with storylines that directly tackle the issue of domestic violence and its after effects on the victim and the community surrounding her. So with that in mind, Today's panel will be discussing how domestic violence has been written and dealt with in speculative fiction, whether or not speculative fiction can help move conversations about domestic violence and healthy relationships forward in a constructive way, and share some hopefully useful tips on how speculative fiction authors can include themes of domestic violence and healthy relationships in their stories. So let's get to the first question. There's been a steady stream of discussion and critique over the years about depictions of domestic violence in mystery, crime, and romance. However, the discussion about domestic violence, especially in horror and in certain quarters of YA fantasy and paranormal romance, where controlling or toxic behavior that male characters exhibit towards women is seen as normal or even desirable behavior, is a more recent development. Do you think this is the case? And if so, why do you think this has happened? Let's go to Rebecca first.
Yeah, it's something that I think is an outgrowth of sort of cultural norms, especially as young children. Oh, that little boy, he's like pulling your hair and he's pushing you. Well, that's just because he likes you. And that's something that is definitely perpetuated again and again over generations after generations. And so taking those thoughts that are sort of taught to you as a child and then bringing them into romantic relationships makes sense. Of course, you also have to take into account sort of cultural norms about, men are allowed to show emotion, so they can't have a sensitive side. So perhaps they can show love by doing these sort of controlling acts. So you combine those, and it sort of makes for something that's very likely to happen. So you combine all those, and it's one large system. So I think a lot of people, especially in the past, really didn't make that connection, and they just thought, oh, this is just the way it is. And I think it's now people are talking about it more and going, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not healthy. That's maybe not the way we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Angela, what do you think?
I love what you say about the little boy pulling the girl's hair and, oh, that's because he likes you. Because it doesn't go the other way. If a little girl pulls a boy's hair, she's a bitch. When women do those kind of behaviors, there's something wrong with us. And I think that's hugely prevalent right now. And part of the reason is because our society, this is my opinion, part of the reason, we're really not allowed to show emotions, either girls or boys. Girls are not allowed to say things like, I don't really like you, or, we have to respond with love and stuff, or we're not feminine and beautiful and yada, yada. And men are discouraged from crying. And so, like, part of that whole, the femme fatale thing, I think is because women don't have permission to share their authentic feelings a lot of times. And so it winds up coming out like this, which is toxic. And I do feel like we're getting better, even though statistically, I was just reading right before the show that we're maybe not getting better, but I would like to feel like we're getting better. Culturally and evolving into more of an authentic equality equation where we can all show our feelings and be honest with who we are, and we don't have to go around pulling people's hair and fainting for attention, and we can just stand on our own as people that are equal.
Okay. Jason?
No, absolutely. And when I was growing up, it was absolutely how you're describing. The men don't cry, and the women have to accept, and young women have to accept the attention because, oh, come on, they're giving you attention. That's always a good thing. And never mind that it's stalking or harassment and all this other horrible stuff. And that's even before you get into abuse and domestic violence and all that kind of stuff. And I hate to say it, I think speculative fiction and horror, all literature has done that, but I think speculative fiction, the different genres, are kind of were well behind the times, and I think it's changing. I think it truly is changing. But through the 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s, you could find just horrific examples in books. And I know when I was young reading speculative fiction, probably for libel reasons, I shouldn't name some of the authors who are still living. But even then, when I'm young, I'm like, wait, what the heck? That's horrible, Yeah, but it was not written that way, and it was, even I was like, so yeah, and it was all throughout the fiction, especially in the speculative fiction genres. It's changing, but it's slow. Needs to be, and there's always pushback every time. there's just constant pushback, and I don't get why, but well, I understand why, but sadly, but it just hasn't changed as much as it needs to.
Okay, so like you said, there are works of speculative fiction that portray domestic violence and other forms of VAW as normal, but there are some that portray it for what it is, horrific human rights abuse. But many authors show or allude to the acts of violence, but do not show the consequences of the violence for the victim and the people around her. If domestic violence appears in speculative fiction, it is more often than not used as a convenient plot widget to advance the story. How can speculative fiction counteract stories and storytelling tropes in popular culture that normalize domestic abuse and glorify it as romance and entertainment for the masses? Rebecca.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and of course, domestic violence can happen with all genders, but it tends to be very gendered in a lot of cases. So one thing I think people can do when they are thinking about portraying this in books or anything is center the woman, center the victim, which is frequently not the case. It's not their journey, it's not their experiences. And it can be like, oh, they're just a plot device so that our like main character feels bad or he has an enemy. So you need to center her experiences, the damage, her feelings, how she experiences things. And that will help a lot, because once you really sort of get into that mindset, it's really a lot easier to portray it in a very understandable and empathetic way. So it doesn't feel like a silly plot device. It feels like a real thing with real consequences, which is, I think, another thing. Like, you have to show that there are consequences. Otherwise, it's just a shock device.
Yeah. Angela?
I completely agree with what Rebecca said. I think part of that, when we have a woman that is, and typically a woman, because we're just kind of going along with the gendered thing, but it does, like you say, I'm glad you brought that up. It happens to both sexes. It's not a exclusive, unfortunate activity. But I think showing in these stories, a lot of times I notice the woman or the victim is alone. You never find out about her boyfriend. You never find out about her children, her mother, her father, her brothers, her sisters, her neighbor, her family. She is always just a set of legs, a white t-shirt, and pretty hair or whatever. And that's who she is. And it's defined as that. And I think making more rounded characters will, help the story, because nobody really wants to read about a Barbie doll that's moving through the story without any impact other than, now I have an excuse to be rage. Well, it will make the character have more authentic revenge if there's a reason why we care about the victim. So I think that just rounding out these victims instead of, like you say, just using them as a convenient plot device to, oh, I need a woman to die here. Okay, here's one, and she's blonde. Oh, no, I'm going to change things up. She's a redhead. Change it up and make her a real person will help a lot.
Yeah.
No,
Jason?
absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think, and as a writer, as an author, the first thing you must do for any character is you need to respect the characters you're writing. If your characters are mere plot devices, if they're merely to get from A to B for someone else's story, you don't respect the characters. It's going to come through, even if you're not showing, horrific things like abuse and domestic violence and all that kind of stuff. Respect the characters. But then you also got to get past trends. I've seen, I'm going to go for this. Probably going to tick some people off, but the Foundation TV show just got launched based on Isaac Asimov's famous series. And there was a lot of pushback from traditional fans because they're like, well, this isn't how he wrote it. But if you read how he wrote it, the women in the original Foundation trilogy they're not even paper thin. I mean, they're like, they are non-existent. I mean, they're there, but they're not anything. And the TV show is trying to fix that. But even now you have pushback on that. It's like people are like, purists are like, oh, well, that's not how it was supposed to be and all that kind of stuff. And it gets back to is, I hate to say it, but he didn't respect the female characters he was writing. To them, they were just plot devices. I'm not trying to say he was inserting abuse and all that into there, but still, I mean, it's the same thing you see. from so many authors over the years in different genres. You know, they just didn't care. They didn't respect the characters, and it shows in what the characters they created and what they did with those characters.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I have this great collection of the best science fiction from the 1950s, which is like,
boy.
this is very interesting. Some things are like, oh, that's so smart. And then other things they get so wrong. And frequently it's about women. It's like, oh, so you are going to space all the time, but you have cell phones and everything, but people are smoking on the airplanes, and also the women are only secretaries.
Yeah.
And it's very bizarre. And so especially when you're looking at older stuff, it can be really jarring, which is interesting. And I think that's also a good representation. Like, if you want to see like how to not do it,
Yes.
that old stuff is a good way to do it, because once you see sort of like modern stuff, usually written by women or frequently written by women, that has full real characters, you'll see, oh, that's the difference here, because these are people and these are not.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So, violence against women in pop culture, including visceral portrayals of domestic violence, it has been a mainstay for years, and it can still draw huge audiences. Do you think we'll ever see healthy, non-violent relationships become a trend in speculative fiction, given that some writers and readers might see it as boring, since extreme behavior such as violence towards women and girls are often used to generate the conflict of power that many speculative fiction stories need for their plots, and which readers actually do crave? Yeah, Angela.
Oh, me start? Okay, sure. Sorry, I thought we were going on a pattern.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
no.
I'll go.
Oh no, that's fine. I was actually going to listen to Rebecca and cheat and just kind of bounce off what she said. But no, I'll start. No, I think yes, we are. I think we're starting to see this already. And I know this isn't speculative fiction, but there used to be no women comics, say. There used to be like these areas that women just aren't in. There's no real women horror writers. I mean, Frankenstein had to be published anonymously, you know. So I think that now, though, we're starting to see this. And like I said, this is not speculative fiction, but Mr. Right, the story is actually about a man and a woman, and they're working together almost as one character. They are equally sharing the spotlight. And I see that kind of thing, or at least I'm hoping that I start seeing that more in fiction, that the characters, it's not a guy who's fighting a serial killer or whatever. It is teams of people that can be male and women, men and women, or, you know, non-binary, but people. And then it doesn't have to be a gender-based thing, like the guy always, you know, saves the day, and also not going over, because, you know, that pendulum can swing the other way. And then sometimes I'll see these women characters that are just unbelievable, that I'm like, is that Arnold Schwarzenegger with a boob job? I mean, really, come on. It's okay to also be a woman. You know what I mean? We are not, a powerful woman is not a man with boobs. We're different. You know, we have way higher pain tolerance. I mean, that's a fact. You know, things like that, you know, so we would be sitting there going, yeah, go ahead and cut off my arm. I've been through childbirth, you know? So I think if we can bring in these things and kind of have more of the spotlight shared between the sexes as working together, that's going to change it. I don't know if I've seen it yet, but like I say, I'm a super optimist. I'm like a really negative optimist. I will tell you the worst thing, but I'm hoping for the best. So that's what I kind of see happening, or hope to see happen.
Let's go back to Rebecca, and also let me just tack on a little question for you. Since you're an editor, do you see it happening as well in your work?
It's interesting, because one thing that authors sometimes have a harder time doing is making sure that there is enough tension or conflict in a book to sustain it, because otherwise, if there's no tension or conflict, you're just writing down stuff that didn't happen. So you do need that conflict and that tension. And for a lot of people, those sorts of relationships are an easy way to add in some conflict.
Very true.
Which makes sense, but you can also take a look at it, pull your story apart and go, wait a second, is there another thing that I can do? Maybe it's a change in their relationship and how they feel about things. Maybe at the beginning, they don't know if they're really going to be a couple anymore. But then as they go along, they sort of rebuild that connection and they work as a team to solve things. And also, I don't see this that much, but I do love it when you see couples basically working as a team trying to do something. I would love to see more of that. I just edited a book by Alexis Hall called Murder Most Actual, which is a mystery novel. And it is a murder mystery a la Clue, Agatha Christie. And it's with a lesbian couple at its center, and they're working on their relationship and also trying not to be killed and to solve the murder. So that sort of stuff is very interesting. So playing with those different dynamics, but also in a way that there isn't like, say, a huge power imbalance in a relationship. I think pointing at good, healthy relationships are important in some way. Like you can show bad, unhealthy relationships, but you need to make it clear that that is bad and actually not something to aspire to.
Jason?
No, I agree. And I think sometimes the bad relationship is the easy cop out to give tension to the story, as you're saying. I love reading comic books and manga, and I'm a romantic at heart. So I want my couples to be shipped and happy and all that. And it's one of my irks that in both comics and manga, you're like, wow, great couple, great. Then suddenly, like we need to mix up this and they just nuke the relationship, and I'm like, for no reason but to create drama, and I'm just like, I can't tell you how many times I don't throw them across the room anymore because it's on my tablet, and I don't want to break my tablet. But yes, no, I mean it's just it's a cop out. You shouldn't do that. But I also want to say, I think part of the problem has been over the years. There are stories out there that have healthy relationships that show, positive examples of people and women and everyone dealing with domestic violence and other this. But in some ways, I think the publishing industry kind of marginalized those stories. I remember reading the Gilda stories by Jewel Gomez. Has anybody read those? Wonderful. Came out in 1991. The kind of an underground classic. Vampires and dealing with domestic violence and stuff. Wonderful, but it was it's one of those. It was not published by a major publisher back then because really it didn't fit in to what the expectations were. And I thankfully I think the publishing industry is starting to catch up, and they're like, and part of that's due to Rebecca, editors like you and publishers and new people who are coming in saying, you know what, we're tired of what y'all been doing, and we're going to change it. And of course, that does rankle some, but it needs to happen because it's like, come on, we're tired of it.
Yeah. Well, okay, speaking of that trope, it's okay, it's just fantasy. It's a very common refrain from readers and fandoms, especially YA fantasy, paranormal romance, to critiques of toxic and abusive relationships in the books they love. So the pushback is usually accompanied by the reader pointing out that the male character is not human. He's a vampire, he's a werewolf, an alien, a fae, and so his stalking, controlling, possessive behavior is seen as non-human and therefore acceptable. Do you think that there will come a time when this type of toxic alpha male character will be less acceptable to readers and eventually phased out, or do you think it will remain an in-demand archetype in speculative fiction? Rebecca.
That's an interesting question, because I might say I would like that trope to go away, but I think I have a sense that sort of the way that gender roles and everything plays a part in things, I think there's always going to be people that really want that, who just see that as like, oh, he's strong and that is appealing, and they don't think like, well, actually he's like a pretty bad guy, but he says he loves her, and
he's cute.
Right. They're always hot, which is, that creates problems. I understand. so I would like to see less of that going forward. And I think it's also how society itself changes. Like, I actually read a lot of, like, on Reddit, the relationships posts or the Am I the Asshole posts.
Mm.
And
Oh,
you
yes.
see a lot of women who are just asking help in their relationship, and they don't understand they're in an abusive relationship. Because, like, oh, well, he hasn't ever hit me, but he does emotionally bring you down, isolate you, financial control. And then there is sort of a sexual abuse aspect, but they don't think of it in those terms. And so I think it's a lot of people, you have to sort of shift their mindset, because when you show something and it is showed in a positive way, it reinforces people for, well, that's not abuse because it was so nice there. It worked out. So their love story was great. They were so cute together. They were so happy together. So I think it can be problematic to do that, because you don't want people to think that this is okay, because it's not. So yeah, authors could show these sorts of relationships, but you don't want to put it up on a pedestal, because it's not going to turn out well, especially for readers who, say, are younger, and they're learning to find out the world. How much did I learn about the world as a teenager just reading an insane amount of books? So that's something to keep in mind.
All right. Angela.
Yeah. I actually have a personal experience with this a little bit. I am a survivor of domestic abuse, which is one reason why I was very excited to be involved with the Pixel Project. And I did not think I was abused. I was one of those women that would be like, well, sometimes I'm a bitch. He never hit me. There was no physical violence. But it ended with a gun and, and I won't go into great detail, and a felony. And afterwards I was talking to the social workers and they were saying, like, you were in an abusive relationship, or this was an abusive relationship. And I was like, no, I mean that was weird. It was actually a PTSD thing, that was weird, but it's been fine for 17 years. Okay, well, abusive relationships tend to have this and this and this and this. And I'd be like, well, yeah, that's actually, that is the way it is. But I mean, that's not really abusive. I was like trying to gloss it over and explain it. And then it wound up being kind of like after everything had split up and everything, he wound up sneaking into my apartment one night and to, like, watch me sleep kind of thing. And I don't want to get too into like, which, yeah, that's creepy. There's reasons why I'm a horror writer. But it was at that time, I think, because there had been so much distance and I had been going to counseling and learning about domestic things that I didn't think were abuse, and all of these things. I could see it all differently. And I realized everything was okay on his end. Like, oh, well, it's because I did this because I wanted to see this. I did this because I wanted. And I think that's where the vampires, I am getting to the point of back to the question. I think that's why a lot of these strong male characters are not human, because then they're excused to not. That's why they acted that way. Well, he hurt her, he bruised her because he's so strong. He accidentally bit her because she smells of blood. She's full of blood. That's yummy. And I think that once we can get away from that mindset of it is never okay. It is never okay to act like that. And women, we have that too sometimes. Like, oh, I was a bitch because I keep using that word. I don't know why I'm using that word so much today. I apologize. But, I did this because I, am PMSing, or I did this. And so we all tend to make excuses. The difference is when that excuse is actually hurting somebody or controlling somebody, that's when it's dangerous. And I think that's where that trope comes from. And yeah, I hope it ends. And I think that it will end. I mean, I think it has to end at some point. And like Rebecca says, I think we're always going to have that need for that. And in a lot of ways, I think it's just trying it out sometimes so that you know what you want. So you may be super into like this gorgeous vampire that's like making all the decisions for her, whatever. But then after you're not 17 anymore, you kind of start realizing, oh, I don't like that anymore, but I role played through. And that's why I think fiction is so valuable. We can role play these things without the repercussions. I don't have to really date a vampire that's controlling every aspect of my life to know that, oh, that sucks. I do not like that. So, sorry, that was really long. I apologize.
No, I get it. Jason?
Rebecca, what you were saying about "Am I the Asshole?" I read that all the time, and I think one of the illuminating things about that Reddit is also it shows why fiction can be so powerful. Is sometimes you need to read stories outside yourself to see really what's going on in your own life. That's the power fiction can have on this issue. Is I didn't realize I was in an abusive relationship, but then I read these stories and it kind of showed me, and I think that's one of the reasons that Am I the Asshole is so powerful is people, you kind of have a chance to step outside yourself and see. I think I remember when I was growing up, I loved the comic Elf Quest. I don't know if anybody's ever read it. It was I had issues I won't go into all that, but it really was a lifesaver for me. And I remember there was a scene where the main character gets mad at his teenage daughter and he raises his fist to hit her. And she's like, looks at him and goes, "Don't you do that." And he stops and she goes, "Who taught you that?" He didn't hit her. He like paused because she looked at him like, "Don't you do that?" And he's like, "Who taught you that?" And he's like, "My father." It's like he realizes what's going on. And I was like, oh, that's the power of fiction. You can really peel back the layers of the onion and see so much truth. And I wish more authors would do that kind of stuff instead of just using it as cheap plot devices, throwing it in for no reason. Oh, hey, character developed, they're abused. No. If you need to write about it, but write about it again from a position of respect. Write about it to really show how it is.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, you are all right. Well, hopefully things will change. But here comes my next question. So there are readers who actually complain that a fantasy series becomes boring when they see healthy relationships because the female protagonist and her love interest have no conflict. For example, Carrie Vaughan's Kitty Norville series is led by a female werewolf protagonist who escapes domestic violence and chooses a solid and stable mate over a hot mess of an alpha male. Believe it or not, there have been grumbles and laments by readers about how Kitty made the wrong choice of partner, even though she actually did choose well. So, do you think there will ever be a time when functional and healthy relationships are seen as desirable and sexy in speculative fiction, even though they don't generate half as much conflict and drama as the toxic ones? Rebecca?
I think that the more of these stories that we see that do this, the more of them will we see. One that people talk about is with Brooklyn Nine-Nine, the TV show, and we have sort of two of our main characters who get married, and they're happy and there's not drama. And so a lot of times people go, well, yeah, the series is basically done. It's going to be really boring, and that's not been the case because relationships do change. You can have healthy relationships that sometimes have conflict, and that's fine. And I personally really like to see those sort of happy endings, at least on a personal level, say maybe not on a worldwide level. The one that immediately comes to mind for me is Sam and Frodo from Lord of the Rings, because their love is just so strong and pure, and you feel that. And I wouldn't feel bored if I saw them actually being happy and like doing other things. So I think the more of these relationships we see and done well, and how you can incorporate these good relationships and have those wonderful feelings, I think the more of them we will see.
Okay. Angela?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's the great responsibility of us as writers, because it is really easy to write just these easy stories where, yes, the woman is the victim, the man is the aggressor. Oh, look, there's another man and he's going to save her. Or, sometimes you'll do the cheap thing and try to swap it of, oh, it's actually a lesbian couple and the lesbian saves her. And look at that. I switched it all up, without really being a good story without really, just inserting a woman's name instead of a man's name doesn't, like I said, Arnold Schwarzenegger with boobs is not a woman character.
No.
But I think we will see that. And I think we are seeing that more. And part of the reason I think that there has been that, because in the past, women were very segregated and they had their role, in society. And males had their role in the whole, men don't cry and women do this thing. And, and a good mother is like this, here's the strict silhouette, hourglass cookie cutter of what a good woman is and a good mother. And now we blend all over the place today. I mean, what is gender anymore? Even really, there's no solid definition of gender or what is a woman or what is a man. And I think because of that, we're realizing that we don't have to be alone. That prior culture separated us. Women hung out with women. Men hung out with men. And every now and then you get a sissy boy who hung out with women, or a mama's boy, or you'd get the tomboy, and there was these negative stereotypes kind of. But we don't have that anymore. So I think we are in like kind of a cultural revival of what is gender. And as we realize that guys can hang out with girls and girls can hang out with guys and girls can hang out, and sometimes girls and girls are lovers and guys are lovers, and sometimes that switches around and sometimes we change later, and none of it is really, we're not rock solid and pinned anywhere anymore. I think that we're going to start seeing these kind of things just disintegrate going forward. And I mean, I hope, like I said, I'm an optimist.
Jason?
Yes, I try to be the optimist on that too, and I'm hopeful that is where we're going. On the pessimistic side of me, you mentioned earlier the men's right movement. I think a lot of men and not just men, women, all genders, sadly, can be heavily invested in harmful tropes of who they must be, and we're seeing this in different ways. I mean, let's be honest, people, you can be shocked at how invested someone can be in their worldview, that we can have a pandemic, for example, ravaging the world, and people are like, oh, vaccines, no, don't get that vaccine, don't go, that'll kill you. So I mean, it's sad how strongly people can be invested in tropes that are killing them. Speaking as a man, I can't tell you how many men I've seen who are fully invested in tropes that eat them alive and make them die young. They're doing harm, don't get me wrong, but you can look at them and see what it did to their lives. And it saddens me. And you talk to them about it, and you can't change their mind. They don't see, they're like, no, this is how it's supposed to be. And so that's the pessimistic side of me, is I think on that, sadly, in some ways, that kind of change takes decades and decades and decades before, I'm hopefully one day I want it to change. It's got to, but it's so many people are so invested in these harmful tropes, and I don't know the solution to that, to make that speed up that change, but it needs to change.
Well, okay, so discussions about relationships in speculative fiction often focus on the dysfunctional aspects, which is kind of what we're doing now. Why aren't there more discussions about the importance and depiction of healthy relationships in speculative fiction? Rebecca.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is because certain relationships, when they're strong and healthy, the question is, when is there conflict? And particularly if you want to say as a hero of a situation, it's very similar to why a lot of children in like books and YA and middle grade and stuff, their parents aren't in the picture, because they wouldn't need to save the world, because their parents would probably do it, but it's left to them. So that is like one way of doing that, because it's like, oh, you're in a healthy relationship, well, obviously they're going to be helping you, right? And to be fair, that adds a little bit of extra layers and complications, and you've got to figure out dynamics and that sort of thing. So I think that is one of the reasons that we see that. And I think it's also because people like seeing a love story happen which is usually the beginning. You know, they want to see somebody who's usually fairly young going out, having an adventure, and falling in love. And then the series or book is done. And we don't really get to see the happily ever after. So, like, the Alona Andrews series is one where it's like, oh yeah, we see that's a long series, and we see their relationship change, and for a lot of it, like, we see them, they are a team. So that's one of the instances where you can see that done well. So I hope more people try to do that. You know, it is a little bit more challenging to do, but I think it's a lot more interesting. And I personally feel like adding different layers, you know, you can add the relationship and the personal along with the external worldwide thing. I think that can be really interesting.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is there's just not enough to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
Angela,
I have views, but
you want to go first, Jason?
oh, sure. I think part of the issue is the stories that people read, and especially in the United States, are very wedded to the Western view of storytelling. In particular, their heroic journey, you know, made famous by Campbell and perhaps, you know, Star Wars would be the example. You know, you have your hero who must be hurt at some point early on so that they can overcome their hurt and move on. But this is a very limited view of storytelling that is not represented around the world. And I think, you know, there's this idea that, oh, the stories that are told here must be this pattern, not all, obviously not all to the heroic journey, but I think that has heavily influenced it. I mean, for example, if you, I remember, you know, talking to someone about stories don't have to have conflict, traditional conflict, don't have to have your truly evil character that you're overcoming. They're like, well, tell me a great story that works. And I said, have you ever seen Spirited Away, the anime? It is a beautiful story, wonderful story. It's gripping. It has tension and conflict, but it doesn't have a traditional evil person. I mean, in the end, they all kind of like, oh, everything kind of works out and no one's really the evil person. You know, there's conflict and all that, but it's, you know, it's a very non-heroic journey, traditional type story, and it works. And I would love to see more of that. I think that, again, I think the storytelling is opening up here in the United States as more stories from around the world are being translated, and that helps a lot. So hopefully, I'm optimistic that will change even more in the coming decades here.
That's an interesting point. Angela, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I feel like I agree with you guys a lot, but I really do actually agree, which is probably one reason why we're all on this panel together. I think bringing up what you're saying, Jason, is it's something in Western culture that we tend to do is it has to be absolutes. A villain couldn't possibly do anything kind because he's a villain. Or a hero is never wrong, which kind of goes to that whole abuse thing of, well, he's the hero. So, yeah, he forced himself on her, but she really wanted it. And he's so cute, you know. And in other cultures, you get more shades where, and that's actually a more realistic way to portray people, is because nobody's evil, completely evil. Though I can think of like one or two people right now off the top of my head that have been in the news, but you know, I'm sure there's redeeming qualities that we just don't know about. And there's nobody that's 100% good. I mean, and that's always the shock when you've got like a hero, and I'm not going to name names, but you know, like a spiritual leader, and then, oh my gosh, you found out they cheated on their wife or something. Oh my God. But in the American mindset, you can't handle it. Now they're disgraced forever. They are really evil. Instead of, it was a guy who was trying to do a lot of good things and he cheated on his wife, and that's bad. But we're all human and we've all done things. And I shoplifted when I was a teenager. And, you know, I mean, everybody's got their little bad things that they've done. And nobody's all good or all bad. But I think one of the resistances to these characters is a little bit of, I mean, kind of going to the pandemic is why I even heard of this concept, but cognitive dissonance, because I was trying to figure out why people could be like, this is a fact, here's a fact, and then they're arguing against it. And you're like, but it's a fact. I mean,
Mhm.
it's just a fact. I mean, science said, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It is 4. I mean, I don't know
Mhm.
how else to say that it's 4. But then I was reading about cognitive dissonance.
Mhm.
And it's where if you admit that it's 4, you have to face that it's 4. And
Mhm.
that is terrifying, and obviously, 4 is not really terrifying except to writers who don't do math. So sometimes 4 is a little bit terrifying for me personally. But using it as an example, I can usually get by if it's not like point anything. But,
Uh-huh.
and that kind of makes me think of characters. In some cases, if a male or a female is afraid of who they are to go outside of those roles, and especially in American culture, I wound up moving to Australia for a while, and when I came back, I realized how into um, becoming a trope we are. Like, are you a goth? I mean, I'm talking like 40, 50 years old. Are you a goth or a jock? Oh, you're a nerd. We have to have these labels instead of kind of,
Mhm.
I am just a person. I'm not a goth, but I like to wear black because it makes me look slimmer and smarter. You know, but you must be a goth. And I've been told I was a hippie. And it's
Mhm.
because I like sprouts. In America, we have to have these labels. So I think we have to keep our characters, or there's a resistance to letting characters be more well-rounded because of that cognitive dissonance. If a man is not the hero, if a man cries, then he can't be a hero, So, and then that means I could cry, or I could, you know, fall outside of my little pattern of what I feel like I should belong to. And that's terrifying to some people.
Mhm. That's a very interesting point. We have a comment from the audience, Andreas, who says, in Peter Greenway's film Drowning by Numbers, the women do not rely on a man to save them, just because it's what we're hoping to see more of in the
Mhm.
future. And a comment from Regina, Hayao Miyazaki and his team are wonderful at depicting healthy relationships in stories, which is true. And like you were saying, they're not the usual kind of relationships that we're all used to in pop
Mhm.
culture.
Yeah, but
American.
so interesting, even
Yeah.
more
I think,
interesting.
just as a side note, one of my favorite mangas of all time is Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind. I mean, Hayao Miyazaki made it into an anime, but the manga he wrote has some of the most complex relationships and
Mm.
beautiful relationships. And people, you're like, this is the evil person, and then you're like, okay, it's just a whole range of stuff, and it's just wow.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
It
have
is.
to plug it anytime I can. I wish more
Understand.
people would read it. It holds up even, oh my goodness, 40 years on, or whatever long, 30 years after he finished it. It's still amazing.
Yeah, which right there is a point as to why we should be writing like that. Because
Yes.
how many slasher films where, white t-shirt blondie gets stabbed or raped or whatever, and she was that, what's the title of that one? Oh, which one? There's
Which
like
one was it? Yeah.
millions, I mean, but you remember that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. You all make good points. Okay. So, next question. Domestic violence is very easy to spot if the abuser is clearly depicted as the villain. However, in many cases, the abuser is cast as the hero, like we've been talking about, and even more insidiously as the romantic lead. So, the most infamous example is, of course, the Twilight series, which has come under heavy fire from many readers and domestic violence activists because it glorifies abusive and controlling behavior by male partners. So, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of how storytelling in speculative fiction can redefine domestic violence and relationships, and how or if these tropes can be incorporated mindfully. Is it ever acceptable for speculative fiction to include domestic violence as a plot point or character shorthand, and where should authors draw the line with using it? Rebecca.
I think one thing that you should never do with domestic violence as a rule of thumb, don't make it just a tiny part of the story. It can't be a throwaway. There are some things that you can just sort of like, oh, that's just a little bit of information. Like, I don't know. There was like somebody like fell down a hole while they were a child or something. It's like, okay, yeah, you can put that in. But domestic violence is such a powerful and overwhelming thing. You will not be able to do it justice. if you spend just a tiny amount on it. So authors should also ask themselves, you know what? How much do I want this to be about in this story? Do I want this story to be a large part of it devoted to this topic? And some authors want to do that, which is fantastic. I love seeing those, and I love seeing characters sort of realize and dealing with the things from their past and what it means for who they are as a person. But that might be not the story that you want to tell, which is totally fine. You might want to tell a completely different story. And one thing I like to tell authors is, okay, well, you have this little thing, but you don't need it in this book. And if you take it out, that's a whole book all by itself. So it's a really big issue that isn't just a throwaway. You know, it's almost like, don't make genocide a throwaway, very, very side part. You know, it's just don't do it. If you want to include it, you've got to really include it. You can't just a little bit include it.
It's lazy writing. It's lazy writing, to be honest. And it's not just this topic. It's in so many aspects of life. If you need a writer, if they truly want to explore it, they need to explore and put it. They need to dig into the issues and truly try to see it. I mean, and of course, let's be honest. A lot of stories are not written to have deep insight. They're just cranked out, and there's nothing wrong with that. But agreed. That's just lazy writing.
All right, Angela?
I think in horror especially, and as a dark poet, you glamorize, or I'm not sure what the word is. I'm going to say prettify. I know that's not a word, but you prettify violence because that is the nature of the beast, so blood is crimson, not just red. It smells like iron, it perfumes, it wafts the scent of it instead of just it reeked of blood. But where you have to draw the line is, what are you describing? So if you want to criticize, say, a demon because you're trying to get empathy with the demon or the monster or whatever, you can do that. But we have to look at the responsibilities that we have. And it is a very easy thing to critify violence against. Somebody give me a better word than critify. Any word than critify.
I think prettify works. I think we all understand that.
Glamorize.
Thank you. I knew there was a better word. But I think, so yes, we glamorize violence in that genre, and poetry glamorizes, darkness and destruction and sorrow. But we have to be responsible with it because it's easy, like you're saying, lazy writing, to do that with, say, a woman. And I think in one of the things in, I don't remember which Twilight book, but her bruises blossom on her. And I remember reading that and going like, oh, I love that. Oh, no, I don't. But that's a really pretty way of putting it. But I'm so conflicted now because that's horrible. Like, he hit her and she's got a bruise. And we all know that those are not pretty in real life. They don't blossom. They're ugly and they're swollen and they distort your face or whatever part of the body.
And they hurt, yeah.
Yeah, and there's veins running through them and stuff. It is not a beautiful blossomy thing. It's not a watercolor painting that happened on her face. And so I think that's where we have to, the responsibility comes in the work. Because, yeah, it would be easy to just make up the story about, and the blood, painted across her face and it was glowing crimson and the bruises blossomed and it's all so lovely. But that's cheap and shoddy writing. And we need to, if we want to, glorify or glamorize, darkness and the horror and everything, we need to do it across the board and not just use the disposable female character that is so easy to, why can't bruises blossom on a man? I mean, if they're going to blossom on her, he got the same skin. It would blossom on him as well. And so that's kind of what I think with what we need to do is, sure, yes, horror writers are horrible people. We write horrible things and we love it, every minute of it. But we need to make sure we're writing horrible things responsibly. And so that we're not, the idea isn't to make horrible things real. It's to provide an outlet and a way to role play horrible things so they don't happen for real, or to give people that maybe are experiencing this a way to realize this is ugly or wrong. And so if a woman who is being beaten reads this, and she's looking in the mirror and her eye is all swollen and it looks horrible, or her lip is all misshapen, and then she reads, oh, well, Belle, it's, it blossomed. It's a sign of love. It's the wrong freaking message. And we need to be better about that, because writers are the conscience of a society. We are literally who is telling people what to think. I mean, and the news. I'm sorry, yes, and the news. But they're telling people the wrong things. We're telling people the good things to think. And books are what shapes a society. Books are what raised me. That's where I learned how to be a person, was through books. So if we are doing a crappy job with what we're putting out, we're going to be promoting a crappy society that we are living in. So hello, that just comes back.
Right. So what are the particular pitfalls that writers who have never included domestic violence in their stories before need to bear in mind if they are thinking of doing so? So let's get Rebecca's advice as an editor, and then Angela and Jason, maybe you can tell us any kind of pits you've fallen into. Rebecca first.
Oh, good question. One thing to keep in mind, you don't have to actually show the domestic violence on the page. You can do that, but you have to be very careful about the way you do that. Once again, it's going back to, you don't want to glamorize it. You want it to have real consequences. It's not something that can just be brushed off. And for some readers, actually not having it on the page, they much prefer, because of people's their past, where that could be something that is very triggering for them and they might not want to read it. So it's possible if you don't include it on the page, you're going to reach more people. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think it's, again, centering the victim. Don't glorify things. You can have your characters really think about what happened and figure out what it means for them. And it's also something that once it happens, it can't be immediately, oh, everything's okay. Oh, he went to prison the next day and then she lived happily ever after and everything was perfect. You need to show real consequences. And one thing that is always really good to do, especially if you want to do this, is perhaps read books, like nonfiction books about domestic violence. One that people always recommend is Why Does He Do That? And I believe that is free online as well. It's a great resource, especially for people who are thinking about, like, maybe I actually am in an abusive relationship. But reading those things can also give you a better sense, or listening to people's stories that are from victims, so that you see them as a real person and you can see the variation, because yes, people do act differently to these situations. And so there isn't one right way for somebody to react. And so you want to be open to those different reactions. And then, how is that person going to be perceived if that's the way that they react to something?
Right. Angela?
Yeah, kind of going along with that. One thing that I always think is cheap, or it's like a guaranteed fail in a horror book, is when you see the monster. As soon as you see the monster, it loses its power. Like Babadook, I loved that movie. I was like into it, and then they showed Babadook, and I was like, it's like a Muppet. It's not scary now. That's the way I kind of think. Like, when you say you don't have to show it, the actual abuse is not the powerful situation, though it's definitely the one that gets the attention. The power in that situation, or the drama, the importance of it, is what comes before and what comes after. The result of that abuse. What does she do? What does he do? What do the kids do? What do the neighbors do? And all of those dynamics that are playing together, and the tension before it. Why is it happening? Her maybe walking on eggshells, or, like, those are the powerful parts of it. And the actual, act of abuse is actually the least powerful part of the situation. And so a lot of times in horror, you see that where a writer, usually a newer writer, feels like they have to talk about the monster, share the monster. This has got to be the most horrible, scary monster in the world. Not understanding it isn't. As soon as you see it, it loses its power. So you don't need to include every gritty detail to make your book powerful and gritty. Show that in the beginning and the after effects, because you also don't want somebody to read that and get the wrong information from it. Like somehow think, oh, this is good, or, you know, or glorified at all, because you're literally promoting that then to possibly somebody else, a real person. And the other thing is like just authenticity. You know, if, you know, it's always kind of an argument of, can you write about, say, a disabled character if you've never been disabled? And if it belongs in the story, I personally, my opinion is absolutely. But make sure you understand what that person is like. Don't just assume like, oh, disabled people are like this, or, you know, women are like this, or people of this color are like this. You know, they all eat this. That's the problem, where we are having these issues and these tropes, and, you know, women are like this and men are like that, and, you know, bruises blossom instead of just being ugly, nasty bruises. And so I think, you know, if you want to write about domestic abuse, if it fits in your story, don't write it because you feel like, oh, domestic abuse is hot, you know, hashtag, you know, this. So I'm going to definitely put my story. I heard Pixel Project is buying stories about abuse, so I'm going to make sure you know, like, don't do that. But definitely I encourage people to write about it, to bring it up to the front, because the more we shine lights on things, the more the power of that thing dissipates. But just be authentic and like ask somebody, you know, go to a woman's shelter and ask, hey, I don't want to be nosy here, but I really want to understand because I'm working on a project, and I'm not using your name or anything, but I just want to understand where you're coming from. And honestly, that might be a welcome thing. And they might say, I don't want to talk about it right now. That was me. Do not talk to me about it. Go away. I don't even want to talk to the Walmart person because I just don't want to talk to anybody. That might also be a reaction, but also accept it. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay. Some people handle things differently. So,
Jason.
I firmly believe that if you want to be a writer, you must also be a reader. You need to be reading and researching. Don't assume you know everything about a topic. Obviously, some, you know, when you've experienced some things, you can write a very powerful story from that without reading and researching it, because you're speaking from your own personal experiences. But otherwise, you need to research, you need to read, you need to also reach out and talk to people. You need to, don't assume you know the topic. Learn, read what other people are saying about it, learn about it. And then if you do that, and then you're like, wow, my story, this is an integral part of the story, not a little plot device, not a little flippant little part of the story, then you probably are going to approach it from a very good place. You know, but yeah, if you want to be a writer, you have to be a reader. I firmly believe that. Someone told me that when I was a young, like in college, and I've seen it so true. It's so true. But I guess that's all I got.
That's good. So we have another comment from Andreas again, who says, Angela's comment on the bruise blossoming reminded me of Susan Sontag's illness as a metaphor. Language is something that forms our views, and we have to be careful about the way we use it. That's correct.
I 100% agree. We are responsible for shaping the society that we live in.
Yeah. And also, if anybody out there wants to read how to include violence, not necessarily domestic violence, but violence against women well in your stories, go and read the stories by Jason and Angela in our anthology, because nothing is shown on the page, but it's very, very evident that something has happened. And what I think both of you concentrated on how that person felt and how long-lasting the consequences of those actions were to their lives. And the villain gets their comeuppance in very interesting ways. So, yeah.
Very satisfying when the
very satisfying.
I love doing that. Yeah, I love. Oh yeah. No, it was. That was a good part of I enjoyed writing that story for that reason. And I was actually, let me lay it all out there. I was I was venting some stuff from my childhood in the growing up in a certain church.
Okay.
Now, here's
Yeah.
fingers crossed my parents don't watch this.
Oh, oh dear. But yeah, go read the stories. They're amazing. Okay. So next question is, all right. So how can speculative writers include healthy relationships in their books and stories without seeming preachy or prescriptive? Rebecca.
I think it's just showing how a healthy relationship works. And it's a little bit of a trope, but it's all about communication. It's all about communication and figuring out what everybody is feeling and how you can approach those situations. So just showing how those healthy relationships function, that's all you have to do. And it can be in the concept of the world is ending, or they're being attacked, or any number of things. But just showing how a healthy relationship can deal with conflict both inside and outside of their relationship. And I think that's all you need to do is you don't have to tell people this is a healthy relationship, but you can show them interacting in a great way and show the love between them.
All right. Angela.
After my incident and my new husband, we've been married 11 years now, brought this up. He said there was a lot of anger against men in my stories. And he said, every one of your stories features a little girl that goes around killing everybody. And I was like, yeah, I find that very satisfying. and she's always really sweet about it. And he said, it kind of reminds me of you a little bit, like you're putting yourself in your story. And I said, well, I probably am. I mean, now I'm kind of embarrassed that you point that out, but yeah, I probably am, because I'm role playing what I wish I could do or what I wish I could have done. And I've recently noticed the last couple of stories that I've written, it was pointed out to me that actually has a happy ending. And it's much less horror and more science fiction. And I think that's me kind of getting over things in the past and healing. And one of the things that I've noticed is the characters, my female characters, they're the same people as me, but they are saying no to things. Like one of them that's coming out in Planet Rising, you actually don't know what happens, but it's a society, like the pod goes up on the planet, and in this society, all the teenage girls have to basically sleep with the guy, the leader of the community or whatever, to propagate. Like that's part of their scientific plan or whatever, to, make people and populate the planet. And she's upset about it, go figure. Young, pretty girl, I mean, she has a problem with it. And so that's kind of where the story starts, is she's having issue with it. And then it gets into like myth and all this other stuff. But in the end, she has not done that. You don't know what her choice was, but it's just that she had a choice. And whatever she chose, she was satisfied with. And I didn't want to get into like, I tend to not avoid sex, but it just isn't necessary. Like I will talk about it. I will dance all around it, but I just don't feel the need in my own work to really get every nitty gritty detail out. We all know how it works. I mean, most of us have done that. So that was like kind of a surprising thing to me. And it's called Destroy with Love or something like that. That's what she uses, is her love is the weapon, not necessarily against him, because honestly in the story, he's an insignificant part of the story. He's the plot movement thing. She had to have a conflict. So there's this dude that she's supposed to sleep with. Now let's move on to the real meat of the story. And then another one that it's coming out in the Don't Break the Oath Women of Horror anthology. And that is about a sex worker, but she's a riot doll. She's an android. So sex literally is her job. And she's not upset about it because it's her function. She's not being abused because it's her job. But then she comes across this male character who does not treat her like an object. And it's not the femme fatale thing of like, oh, he treats me like a real girl, I'm so excited. But they form this relationship and this bond based on exactly who they are, coming from their different perspectives. And I really love that story, how everybody is just a strong character and they work really well together. There's a villainess, and they work in tandem to defeat her. And I see that a lot more in my work. It's a lot less of the victimized woman or the woman victimizing, but just people working together, because there's a lot of problems in the world. And if we need any tension, they look outside, there's some tension, and I guess that's what my characters are starting to do, is working together to solve these problems together as equals, rather than I'm a cute little girl and I have to pretend to be nice to you, but I'm going to stab you in your sleep. And that's the old me. And I've never actually stabbed anybody. Don't go in my basement.
Thank you for clarifying that. Jason.
At my heart, I'm a people watcher. I love humanity. I mean, I'm not blind to or don't ignore the flaws of humans and humanity, including myself. But I love watching other people and trying to understand and know other people. And I think I try to put that in my stories. And when I'm also a avid reader. When I read stories, I can tell which authors have tried to do the same thing, where they've tried to understand the people around them, and they've seen, wow, here's an example of just a beautiful relationship between two people, and here's a bad example. Here's another type of person doing this thing, and you can see who's really they're trying to capture in their writing a true understanding of other people and themselves and all that. And I think if you do that, it really does. It can show a beautiful relationship. It can show all of what y'all are talking about. The flip side of that is, you've got writers who just, I've got, let me pull a character from the shelf. Oh, this will be character B, da 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 da, and that shows up in the writing too. That does show up in the writing, sadly. And it's, I'm not going to fault it if that's what they want to do, but I prefer my stories where you're reading the character and you're like, wow, this character is as real as someone I met just today in my own life, and that's what I want. And I think if you try to aim for that with your writing, it's a great thing. Try to understand other people besides yourself.
Yeah. All right. So, what can speculative fiction teach other fiction genres about writing about domestic violence and about writing healthy and realistic relationships and stories? Is there anything, Rebecca?
Good question. I think they can learn that there is various ways for things to happen. There are more possibilities. Because science fiction and speculative fiction and horror and all that sort of stuff, we don't have as strict of rules. We can create the world to fit the story, which I think is something that they do really well. One book I would recommend sort of on this sort of topic that I think is done particularly well is Alice by Christina Henry. Christina Henry also wrote our last story in the Giving the Devil His Due anthology, but Alice is really great. Alice is a sort of a take on Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland is traumatized by her encounter with the rabbit. She is put into a mental hospital, and she finally escapes with her new friend Hatcher, who lives next door, and she goes throughout the city to get revenge on the rabbit. But it's not about really avenging the rabbit. It is her story and her journey about how she deals with what has happened to her and how she makes herself stronger. And that it also includes building a solid and healthy relationship with someone. So I think that's something that is a really good example on how you can do it in a very interesting, understandable, and empathetic way.
All right. Angela?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think the strength of speculative fiction for that kind of thing is that we will go there. Whatever is happening, we will go there. In romance, you have, your guidelines. The heroine shouldn't be ugly. there's these like little things that you have to work with, but in horror and science fiction and fantasy, it's all on the table. We can do literally anything. And I think that is, especially with delicate topics like this, you can play around with it, and you can go outside of the norms. One story that deals with racism that I just thought was amazing and powerful. It's by Leonard Spicer. It's actually his first story, and I am so impressed by this man. And it is in 139 of Space and Time, but it's called Interference, and it's about racism and financial disparity and everything, but he uses color light waves. And so it's blue and everything. They don't say things, they emote or they shine, or they, he uses a whole nother language for how they communicate. And there's the amber waves and the red waves, and this whole story plays out. And no fingers are pointed at anybody. Nobody can read the story and go, oh, obviously the red people are the Caucasians and, da, 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 da. And I just thought it was beautiful because he shows this story. I think a lot of times what happens in other genres is people get offended, so they don't absorb the story. I don't want to hear that the short girls with hats and glasses are the bad people. That's not possible. But I could maybe see myself in a blue light wave that's very selfish and, writes only about little girls that kill people, and I can see why that might not be a good character to be, so I think that's why speculative fiction, that's where our power lies, and to change things is because we build worlds, and at our whim, we decide what the norms will be. Like 1984, we all know how bad Big Brother is, and corporate greed and not using your mind to think and standing in line and doing everything you're told because of that book. And many others, but that's the one on the top of my head.
Yeah. Jason, what do you think?
And also, I think speculative fiction, by setting stories in a different world, is able to overcome the cognitive dissonance that a lot of people have to not truly looking at an issue. Well, I'm set on my views on racism because, I'm right. I believe this A, B, C, but then you can write a story that approaches the issue that may get that person look at it and change their mind because they don't realize they're doing it. It can kind of break down the barriers. I think that's a true strength of the genre, which is another reason why you need good stories and good characters, because it has that power. But I think speculative fiction, for too many stories, don't use that power, if you know what I'm saying. They take the easy way out, so to speak. But yeah, it's you can say, I just love how you can approach an issue that's the hot topic today, and people, if you write a realistic story about this, no one's going to read it, or it's going to not work, or it's going to really, the people who need to read it are not going to read it. But if you set it in space on a space station 300 years in the future, you can kind of open some minds with that, and I think that's a power that I love it.
I think that should be our goal as writers, like all of us, is that we write work that one day somebody's sitting there having their morning coffee and going, yeah, that one character, God, what a jerk. I do that same thing. Hey, am I a jerk? That's what we should be aiming for, is exposing these flaws so that we can all evolve and get better and be such a boring, perfect race. There's no more conflict, and we all die of boredom.
No, then we all go to space and find more conflict.
That's true. There's plenty of conflict out there. I bet. I'm sure.
We are such a drama species. We are always going to create our drama. Trust me. We're never going to run out of the drama. We solve one drama, we will find more.
We will. All right. So final question. Rebecca and Angela, you already did mention some books that you would recommend, but so my next question is, what other speculative fiction books would you recommend that aspiring writers read to see good examples of domestic violence and its consequences being handled well? Rebecca.
The one that comes to mind, and I think we might have even talked about this earlier, but it's the Others series by Anne Bishop. That's really interesting because I like that, vast majority of sort of the traumatic experiences happened in the past. And we are seeing our character learn how to deal with that and see her slowly start to heal from it in different ways, which I really, really enjoyed. And it's not quite speculative. It's not quite domestic violence, but one that I just keep coming back to while we're having this conversation is Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Very literary, very different than a lot of the stuff we've talked about. But it's all very internal and nuanced. And it's about a butler and thinking about his relationship with his employer, who he's thought highly of, and coming to grips of that may not be true. So that's something, it's only slightly related, but I think it's something, especially for writers, reading that could open up some different avenues of the ways that they can explore stories.
All right, Angela?
Yeah, I feel really bad because I'm trying to think of the author. And I love this guy, and it was one of the best books I've ever written. If you can, I've got it on my shelf. Let me just grab it really quick.
Yeah,
I'm so
grab
sorry.
it.
Like, Harvey, Harry.
Go grab it. You'll go to Jason.
Okay, thank you. It's called Born Lucky, but I can't remember his name.
Okay.
I think Gideon the Ninth by Tasman Muir. I highly recommend. It shows how you can overcome the pain in relationships, and how you can work through stuff and move on. I'm looking forward to reading more novels in the series, but I highly recommend that one. It shows how the pain, we carry it forward until you can find a way to kind of deal with it. I don't know. It's hard to describe, but I highly recommend that one.
All right. Okay. And
I see nodding, so I assume I'm not the only one.
No, and then what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to turn around and look at my books really quick.
Okay.
I'm sure there aren't any that it's like, Rebecca, why didn't you think about that?
So Rebecca mentioned The Courtyard of the Others just now. We also mentioned Soulwood by Faith Hunter. So that's another one. Yeah. And Angela's back.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right.
Oh, is it my turn already?
Yes, it's your turn.
It's Born Lucky by, gosh, I can't read this text. And I actually met this guy in real life. I am so ashamed. Oh, A.T.L. Seibel. But yeah, it is a very little known book. He is a mailman. Nobody even knew that he wrote any books. And yeah, long story there. It was kind of one of those fairy tale, reader discovers author moments. But in his book, it is definitely like a kind of a magical realism fantasy, but the women characters and the male characters are people. They are so well rounded that I swear that I know them. And there is some relationships where it is set in, I think, kind of like maybe the 20s era. So there is kind of this sense of like she's a proper woman, and there is that, but he doesn't dwell. I don't know. They are just well-rounded characters, and they have a healthy relationship. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. That's the funny thing, is it's a healthy relationship, but he's constantly misunderstanding her intentions and therefore reacting, on what he thinks that she's, basically wouldn't like him, and the same thing with her. And it's just one of the best books that I've read probably in the last 5 years. I absolutely loved it. And so I never do this because I have a really blown out book budget. But after I read that one, I bought every single book that he had and ordered it. And I haven't gone through all of them yet because, I have like a huge stack of to be read stuff. But I absolutely loved it. And not to, I would love to say something more intelligent, but like Harry Potter, the interaction of all the characters and the romances that form. I love how those are portrayed because they're very, yes, there's teenage obsessions, and then, they don't make it. It's okay because every cute person you see doesn't have to be the love of your life. And, so that's another one that I think of like that. I mean, it's not really going directly to your answer, but, that's my best answer.
Yeah. Sorry, we were wanting books that depict healthy relationships, and you're right, they do. They're normal relationships that people have with conflict, and so
Yeah, and that's the
reaching out.
conflict is all outside of them, really. I mean,
Yes.
they have their internal conflict, but it's not the traditional, Harry has to be the jock and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah, correct. Yeah. All right. So that was our last question. So thank you very much to the panel for this amazing discussion. And thanks to the audience for the comments. Yeah, we had a lot of fun talking about a very heavy topic. So thank you very much. And before we wrap up, I want to remind everybody, those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of our first charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, which Angela is holding up right now. That's the special edition cover, by the way. So you can get that from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. All net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's programs and initiatives and campaigns such as this one alive and kicking. So I'm going to share a little slide. Here we go. I hope you can see that. Okay, there it is. Yep. Oops. Okay, it disappeared. This is tricky, isn't it? Sorry, that's never happened before. Okay, I'll try again in a bit. So anyway, we have this campaign going on, and we are right now $3,935 to our $5,000 goal. The fundraiser ends end of this month, so please do give generously. We have also teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer a special anthology bookplate for early bird buyers. Each author will sign 16 bookplates, and it will be available on a first-come, first-served basis. Each bookplate includes a resource for domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in 205 countries. So let's see if I can put that up again. Hopefully it works. Here we go. Okay, so that's the link, which our chat box moderators are going to put up in the chat box as well, so you can just click it. So it's bit.ly/giving the devil his due. That's a page on our website, and you can go there and find out all about the anthology, find out how you can get your hands on the book plates, and get all the resources. Okay, so oh, there it happened again. Sorry. Okay, we can handle this. Besides the anthology, we also have the Read for Pixels campaign that's going on. So if a horror anthology is not your cup of tea, we have lots of other goodies, swag from plenty of authors that are available on our Rally Up fundraising page. So we've got stuff from authors from genres as diverse as romance, mystery, young adult, and of course science fiction and fantasy. So you can donate to get these goodies on the Rally Up page, and the links are going to go up in the chat box as well. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, go to the link that Regina's putting on the website as well, on the chat box as well. And if you want to find out more about violence against women, what you can do about it, we have a lot of resources on our website where you can just, learn what it looks like and get some tips and suggestions of what you can do to help. That's the Pixel Project, www.thepixelproject.net. All right, so before we say goodbye, we have a couple of announcements. So Angela, you have an announcement.
Oh, yep, about books coming up. We got Shadow Atlas is coming from Hex Publishers, November 30th. A poetry book that I did with Geneva Flynn, Lee Murray, Christina Singh, and I did a poetry book called Tortured Willows. It's releasing the 8th of this October, like the 8th of this week. And then Don't Break the Oath, Women of Horror Anthology Volume 4 from Kendisha Press is coming out October 31st. And interestingly enough, all of those books, the stories are about domestic violence. I mean, there's some element of what we're talking about, which is kind of funny because that worked out really good. It might be something I care about, maybe.
Possibly, yeah. Jason, you have an announcement as well.
Oh yes, my book Plague Birds novel just came out. It's basically science fiction. What reads kind of like dark fantasy. Ooh. Check it out. It's from Apex Books. I'm pretty proud of it. I think people will enjoy it. It does touch on some of these issues quite a bit. It is, again, it was a very personal story for me. I hope people enjoy it.
All right, cool. Sorry, I'm looking this way because I have another screen here and I'm trying to share the link. I don't know what's wrong with my computer today.
It's
Okay,
the sun flares. We'll say that.
Yeah. So it's early morning where I am. The sun is shining very brightly. I live in the tropics. So, okay. So I should share the link to Jason's novel. There you go.
Thank you.
So go and check that out. And all right, so all that's left for us to say is thank you very much again, panel. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. And goodbye.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being here.